Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for being here. My name is Lauren Williams, and I'm Adult and Community Services Manager for the Columbia Public Library, which is part of the Daniel Boone Regional Library System. Welcome to today's Lunch and Learn. We've got a representative from Local Motion, which you may have known formerly as PedNet, who will share with us the organization's campaign for Como Livable Streets. Today's Lunch and Learn is co-hosted by the library and the League of Women Voters of Columbia Boone County. So before we start our program, I just have a couple of the usual Zoom housekeeping items. To ask questions of our presenter today, as usual, we'll be using the chat feature. So if you hover over your Zoom window with your mouse, you should see that chat bubble icon at the bottom. Or if you are on a tablet or a smartphone, you may have to tap in the middle of your screen to get to those menu items. We are recording this presentation today, so it will be available in the next day or two on both the League's YouTube channel and the library's YouTube channel for future viewing. And now I'd like to welcome our moderator, League of Women Voters of Columbia Boone County President, Barbara Hoppe. Thanks so much, Barbara.
Thank you, Lauren, and thank you to, as always, to the Columbia Public Library for co-sponsoring our Lunch and Learn programs. Welcome, everyone. Before I introduce our guest speakers today, I have an important announcement I would like to share with everyone. Sharon Schneeberger is heading up a local effort for the November 8th election with the Missouri Voter Protection Group. And she needs more volunteers to sign up to help on election day to protect the vote. And so she's going to put some information about that in the chat, and then you can contact her directly to sign up for that program. And I also sent out an email this morning to all League members about that effort. So you can look at that email also to sign up. So just wanted to share that with all of you because it's so important for the November 8th election. So with that, today we are going to hear from Local Motion's Chief Executive Officer, Lawrence Simonson, about their campaign for Como Livable Streets. But before I turn it over to Lawrence, I wanted to share a little bit of history with you about Local Motion. As many of you may know, Local Motion was previously known as PedNet. And I wanted to mention that I first got involved with PedNet back in 1999 when we were working on the effort to save Stevens Lake and keep it from being turned into a shopping mall. And at that time, Chip Cooper and Ian Thomas were the head of leading PedNet, and they joined the efforts of Save Stevens Lake. And eventually we were able to work on a park sales tax to help purchase Stevens Lake and then provide funding for parks and trails for the future. And Chip Cooper was on I was the committee co-chair for the park sales tax in 2000 committee, and we worked to produce a flyer for the park sales tax. And so Chip Cooper and PedNet were very, very helpful in getting the park sales tax and saving Stevens Lake. So I just wanted to share that with everyone as part of the history of Local Motion. And with that, I'll turn the program over to Lawrence to tell you about their campaign for livable streets.
Yeah, hey, thank you, Barbara. I really appreciate that. One of the greatest things about working here with Local Motion and formerly PedNet is the major and impactful history that we've had throughout the community. It's something we're very proud of and proud to continue the work so many have done before us. So I'm going to jump right in, and I'm going to tell you all a little bit about Local Motion just to get you all started, to kind of help you out, understand what we do and who we are. And then I'll move a little bit into streets and why we're focusing on streets and what that means for us in Columbia and you as well. And then a little bit about our Livable Streets campaign. If you do happen to have a question while I'm talking, feel free to throw it in the chat or something like that. I'm sure Lauren will catch it and share it with me. I'm okay with being interrupted. Just be forewarned, if I'm interrupted, I very easily go off on tangents for long periods of time. So a little bit about Local Motion. So who we are, we are a bunch of policy, infrastructure, and transportation nerds. That's how I describe us. We really love everything that has to do with those three things and how they all kind of come together and when they intersect. We are an advocacy organization. Most people think of non-for-profits as service-oriented. So, helping the hungry, helping the unhoused folks, taking in animals, those types of service organizations. We're a little bit different in the sense that we do advocacy. And to be quite frank, a lot of people don't know what advocacy is. I'm assuming many on here probably know what it means. My mom still doesn't quite get it. The way I describe what an advocate is, or what that means to do advocacy, is I say that I'm similar to a lobbyist, except that I don't get paid nearly as much and I have a soul. And so that's the big difference between me and a lobbyist. And if you can think about what a lobbyist does, that's kind of what we do. We are out there championing and fighting for a world that we believe in. We want to see us move towards that world. We are an independent nonprofit. Most people think that Local Motion is a part of either the government, the city. We are not. We often used to get compared with Get About Columbia. We are not Get About Columbia. That's a city program. We are a standalone non-for-profit. And as Barbara mentioned, we've been around for over 20 years doing work here in Columbia. We are local. So all my work focuses right here in Columbia. So my work is to make Columbia the best town it can possibly be. And I do that through policy, infrastructure, and transportation. Now, we do statewide work as well, but it's a different department within here. It's a group called Missourians for Responsible Transportation that we founded. And we founded that organization because we figured out that there's a lot of communities around Missouri who want to do the same work that we're doing here in Columbia, but they don't have their own local motion. And so we developed Missourians Responsible Transportation to help them out. And we also developed Missourians for Responsible Transportation to go down to the Capitol and deal with any kind of statewide legislation that may have an effect here in Columbia. So our vision, there's towns built for people where it's easy to walk, bike, and ride public transit, and everyone can get where they want to go. And we do that through our mission. And our mission is to provide walking, biking, and transit solutions to meet people's everyday transportation needs. And the thing I want to point out here is nowhere in here did I say, we are here to make every person in Columbia bike, walk, or use public transit. That's not our goal. Our goal is to simply make the community better, as I mentioned before. And through all of our studying and researching and analysis, we have determined that if we make things better for biking, walking, and public transit, even if you yourself never actually end up using one of these modes of transportation, but if we make things better for these modes of transportation, other things in our community automatically start to improve. And so we can be a major part of the solution. So what do we do? I mentioned we're advocates. And so we advocate for policies and infrastructure that ensure transportation systems are safe and convenient for everyone. I really want to focus on that term, everyone. Oftentimes, when we build our transportation systems or we talk about our transportation system, we generally are only thinking about ourselves, or we're thinking about a certain group of people. And we really want to think about our transportation much more holistically and how that involves everybody in our community, whether it's a kid, whether it's an older person who's retiring their driver's license, whether it's high income, low income, no matter who it is, able-bodied, disabled, we want everybody to be able to use our transportation system safely and conveniently. And the reason we do this is because, as I mentioned, all of our studying and researching and analysis, it has shown us that when communities are very walkable, when they're very bikeable, and there's great access to thriving public transportation, that those communities are a lot stronger. They tend to be more equitable. They are always happier. In fact, the happiest country in the world, is no surprise to me, is also the country in the world that has the most access to biking, walking, and public transit. It's better for business. Generally, we see areas that are walkable or bikeable or have access to public transit they tend to have the highest revenue, they tend to be the highest revenue generating businesses in any community. If you think about Columbia, the number one revenue generating place in Columbia per square foot is not down on Nifong. It's not the mall. It's not any of the areas that, you know, have a Walmart or a Target or anything around them. It's downtown. And downtown is the most walkable, bikeable public transit access area in Columbia. And so it holds true even in Columbia, but it also holds true in any community we look at. And obviously, when there's access to these modes of transportation, you're healthier, inevitably. I mean, you're doing some sort of physical activity, walking or biking, or even walking to the bus station or from the bus station. The problems we're currently working on or trying to solve is our current road design standards. And what a road design standard is, and I'll go into this a little bit more, but a road design standard is basically an architectural drawing or a cross-sectional drawing of what a road should look like. And we have those in Columbia and all across the country, but in Columbia, we've adopted those architectural designs for every single type of road in Columbia. Currently, we believe that those designs prioritize people driving cars or prioritize car driving specifically. And that can cause a lot of problems. And I'll kind of go into that here in a little bit more. But the real thing to think about is, when were these design standards developed? Who developed them? Why were they developed? And when you really take a deep dive into it, which we will, they're very outdated. For all intents and purposes, the last time we did any kind of road design update in Columbia was 20 years ago. That was the last time we did anything. And that's when Columbia adopted what is known as complete streets. And before that, though, there really hasn't been any significant update. So you could almost say that for the last 75 years, we've been using the exact same standards that were first developed way back when. And so they're completely outdated. They're also incredibly inequitable. If you don't own a car in Columbia, it is very hard for you to participate in society. If a driver's life, you're an older person and you have to retire your license, all of a sudden you lose your independence and dignity because you can't get around the community. It's very inequitable to design a transportation system around one mode of transportation. It's also very dangerous. The United States has the most dangerous transportation system of the developed world. By far, every year in our transportation system, over 40,000 people die on it. It's incredibly inefficient. The United States transportation system moves the fewest number of people per hour than any other transportation system in the developed world. So it's incredibly inefficient. It's incredibly expensive. We spend more than any other country in the developed world on our transportation system, and it's incredibly unpleasant. And the best example I can give you is just this picture right here that's on your screen. Nothing is pleasant about this photograph. Nobody is saying to their sweetheart on a Friday night, hey, let's go out on the town tonight. Let's grab the kids. Let's go down to this street. We'll walk and go to the restaurant or visit the insurance place. This is not a pleasant place. Where do people in Columbia go? They go to downtown. And think about when downtown was developed. Long time ago. So I usually ask this question in when I'm in person, and I throw it out to the crowd, but to save time and any kind of confusion, I'll just say one of the questions we always ask then is, so why don't more people walk, bike, or use public transit? And a lot of times the answers I get are things like it's inconvenient, it feels unsafe, weather, distance. Those are the answers I usually hear. And while all those are somewhat valid points, when you go to other countries, they don't have the distance that we do here between things. And there's a reason why, and I'll go into that a little bit here. If you go to another country, they still have bad weather, but yet people still bike and walk quite a bit. In fact, the quote we often use is, if your excuse not to bike and walk is weather, that means you're spending a lot of money on a raincoat. Saying that the car is your raincoat. Distance, safety is definitely a valid concern. I mentioned how unsafe our transportation system is. So what it boils down to, really, if you look at the data, what it really boils down to is the reason why most people don't do these activities more here in the United States and Columbia is based on how our transportation system is designed. So the infrastructure and how it's set up. I mentioned complete streets a little bit ago. This was adopted in Columbia in 2004. This was probably the most significant update to our road design standard that we had seen in quite some time. At the time in 2004, when this was adopted, it was pretty cutting edge. We were ahead of the time. We were the first in Missouri. I think we were like top 20 in the country when we adopted this. However, since then, the design standards have significantly changed, and we haven't done anything to keep ourselves caught up with the rest of the country and the rest of what's considered best practices. And so we've really fallen behind. And what complete streets are, when you build or design a street, what you have to do is make sure that you're considering other potential road users. So when you build a road, you need to think about people walking, people in a wheelchair, potentially people biking. And so that roadway needs to include things such as possibly a bike lane or sidewalks. And so we did this about 20 years ago. That's why you start to see more bike lanes and sidewalks around Columbia. However, we've learned a lot of lessons since then, and we think it's time for an update. So what are equitable complete streets? Equitable complete streets are things that aren't designed with those other people in mind, those other modes of transportation in mind. They are designed to give those modes of transportation the things they need to feel safe and for it to be convenient, not simply just providing a painted white bike lane, because we know that if you paint a white bike lane on a roadway, that's not very equitable. The people that use that are probably people that already bike a little bit. But if you're a parent who has a young child, say 8 to 10 years old, you're not going to use that bike lane because it doesn't feel safe for you. And to me, that's not very equitable. When our streets are in disrepair, or when the sidewalks end or don't go places that they should go, that's not very equitable. And so equitable streets, or what we call livable streets, are streets that prioritize these modes of transportation to ensure that they are the infrastructure that is designed for them is equitable. And the reason we focus on this is just what I've been talking about. People shouldn't have to spend $20,000, $30,000, $40,000 on a piece of equipment just to participate in society. That's just not fair. And there are people that can't do it. There are people that have lower income jobs that becomes a huge portion of their income. There are families that are one-car families, and that means that those people in the family that don't have access to the car are held back. There are young people that don't drive. There are older people that don't drive. There are people with disabilities that don't drive. And so by not providing transportation for these other folks, they are really being held back. And we want to make sure that we're designing for the other modes so that people can get to their school, they can get to their jobs, they can get to the grocery, healthcare, whatever they need, and they can do it in a safe and convenient way. So what is the problem with the car-centric society? I think I've mentioned several of them. People can't access their jobs. Right now, if you talk to any of the manufacturers that are, say, out on Lamone or out on Paris Road, and you ask them, what's the number one issue? One of the number one issues, it definitely is probably the top 3 issues for your staff or your employees, and they say it's the transportation. It's their ability to get to and from work, whether that's just plain get there at all or even get there on time. So it's a huge issue for employers. Obviously, it's a huge issue for employees who are trying to make a living wage and who need to get to these places. The question I always ask when I show this slide in person is, when you see this person walking on the side of the road, what's the first thing you think of? What's the first thing you say? And what is usually the answer is, what is that person doing? What is that lady thinking walking on this dangerous road? And that, I think I would like to stress to all you, and this is in every situation, whether it's a person walking or if you see a person riding a bike on a road that you like, what is that person riding their bike there for? That does not seem safe, or that doesn't seem like the smartest decision. Reframe your question. Why didn't we as a society provide safe infrastructure for that person? That's the question I think we should be asking. Not why is that lady walking in that ditch on the side of the road, but why didn't we provide safe access for that person? Or think about the person riding a bike in a road that you don't think is safe or convenient for that person to be in. They are not doing that because they are trying to be risky or they're trying to get in your way. They made an intentional decision that said, this situation that you are thinking of as a crazy wild decision for them to be riding there, they have weighed the cost benefits of the other places that they would have to ride and decided that that was the safest and most convenient way. And if you think that that is a dangerous place for that person to be, we shouldn't be asking ourselves, why is that person there? We should be asking ourselves, why can't we, or why aren't we providing them safe access to where they need to go? And so I challenge you to do that throughout your day and moving forward. So why are we so car-centric? And this is where I'm going to talk a little bit about the history in a second. But the real reason we are so car-centric, again, I usually throw this out to the crowd, but the reason we're so car-centric is because we designed it that way. And I'll get into how we kind of got there, but we designed it that way. This is not organic. We didn't just like start the way people started driving cars and then the free market determined that we need to start designing our transportation system in this way because this is somehow the better way. That's not what happened. These were intentional decisions that have been developed over the last 75 to 100 years. And we can intentionally change those decisions and start to design cities in a way that are better for people walking, biking, and using public transit. In fact, there are countries and cities all over the world that are making these intentional decisions. And when you go to them, if you don't know their history, you assume that they've always been that way. The example is always Copenhagen. People go there, there's tons of walking and biking, or Amsterdam, tons of walking and biking. People say, this is so great. And you come back to the United States and you wish we could be like that, and you say, well, that's just not our mentality. But really what it is they made an intentional decision to shift. At one point in the 1970s, if you visited Amsterdam or Copenhagen, you would think you were almost anywhere in the United States today. They turned things around and designed their cities and countries to be more livable. So now I'm going to give you a quick history on streets, and this will kind of help teach you where we came from and how we got to where we are. So it kind of answers this question of why are we so car-centric? Keep in mind that any one of these slides I'm about to talk to, I could spend an hour just talking about one of the slides. And so I am giving you a very brief history and skimming and skipping over a lot here. So short history. This is how streets really began. If you even go back to the Roman times and you look at the design of streets back then, they were basically just open areas with buildings on one side and the other. Probably what happened here is one person came in and said, I'm going to set up a building here. And people started visiting that building. And then pretty soon someone came along and said, hey, I really like this area. I'm going to set up a building too. Where do you think I should do it? And they said, oh, I don't know, about 20-ish feet over there across this, we'll start making this the street. So there was really no design or anything that were put into place. But the first buildings were usually these wood buildings. Oftentimes they were one story, and then eventually they become 2 stories. And what you'll see here is these porches. If you look at the porches, particularly of old Western towns like this one, that's really the start of sidewalks. So that's where the kind of the history of sidewalks come from, these kind of porch areas. After several years, if this area became really popular, these wood buildings would be torn down and they would be rebuilt with brick buildings, or in our times, more concrete buildings, but buildings, more brick and mortar type of buildings. And they would eventually go up beyond 2 stories. They'd go 3, 4, 5, and on up from there. Now, if you went behind these buildings, maybe not the street right behind these buildings, maybe a few blocks over, what you would find is this neighborhood again. So things would naturally and organically grow. These wood buildings would eventually become brick buildings. The streets behind them would kind of, onion out. And so maybe 5 blocks out from here, they have these wood buildings. But eventually, as the city continued to grow, those buildings again would be turned into brick and mortar buildings, and so on and so forth. But what you see, the street has evolved, but not a whole lot. It's evolved in the sense it's a little bit wider. It's brick and mortar, but there's still no traffic lanes. There's really no laws or anything like that here. This is a place for people, is what it really is. And as you see in this picture, there's horse and buggy, there's people walking. If you really dig into this picture, there's people just standing in the middle of the road talking. And so this was a vibrant, lively place. And this is how society operated and how the roads were used primarily back when this picture was taken. However, when we move forward to about the 1920s or so, a little bit before that, but really the 1920s is really where it started to kick off. We started to see the car being introduced to our cities. And this caused some problems. And I'll go into what those problems are. But who do we think, before I talk about what those problems are, who do we think owned those cars at the time that were first coming to the cities? And who they were the rich, wealthy, very privileged folks. So the upper 1% and 2% of the population who is originally owning cars and bringing them into the cities. And when they brought them into the cities, there was a huge outcry that said these things are dangerous. They cannot be in cities. They cannot be mixing and mingling with people who are walking in the roads, horse and buggies in the road, even light rail. They cannot be here. There was a huge public outcry. If you all remember several years back when the birds arrived, the bird scooters, that is exactly what happened in the 1920s when cars started showing up in our cities. Get them out of here. They are a eyesore. They are bad. And so there started to be a huge public outcry, lots of legislation, lots of advocacy saying the cars cannot be here. And so there were newspaper articles written, there were comics that were drawn about how the car is deadly and it's a death machine. This was a massive social issue that people were dealing with in the 1920s. There's another one. But as I mentioned before, who owned the cars? The wealthy, rich, privileged folks. So what this meant was they started to push back. They had access to newspapers. They had lots and lots of resources. And so they started coming up with things that made walking seem like it was bad, such as saying that, walking stinks because of the rain. Remember, we talked about how that's now a big excuse in the United States is, well, what if it rains? I need my car. It also talks about watch out for the car. So the car should be the thing that's in the road and you need to watch out for it. There's a fascinating history on jaywalking. We all know it as a law that you're not allowed to cross the street in an unmarked area. But if you go and read the history on jaywalking, it's very fascinating. I'll just quickly say that back when the jaywalking law was adopted, the term jaywalking was incredibly offensive term. I'm not going to say what I think the term was nowadays. I'm going to try and keep this PG to G rated here, but it was an incredibly offensive term. They started using it to blame people who were walking across the street. And eventually, those in power were so successful at this kind of shaming that it became the title of a law that we all have today. AAA started putting out propaganda about playing away from traffic. Kids used to play in the traffic in the streets all the time, but no more. You need to play away from cars because this is where cars should be. Watch for turning cars. There's never any kind of information that said that the car driver should watch for people. So lots of this type of propaganda started coming out and eventually became what's known as victim blaming propaganda back then and still today. Then in about the 1920s, 1930s, the National Highways User Conference was developed. And what this is, not an actual conference. I know they had conferences, but what they are is a group of about 30 automakers and auto interest groups that came together. And they came together specifically to work on legislation to get funding, tax money funding, to be put towards our roadways for car-specific infrastructure. And when the money was put towards it, this was some caveats they had written in there, that when it was written in for car-specific infrastructure, that meant people that were not in a car shouldn't be allowed to use that infrastructure. And so this was a big charge that this group did, and they started to get tax money towards road infrastructure. They also put out a lot of, more propaganda about how roads will save us, how roads are the way to the promised land. We're going to remake America. So there was a lot of propaganda that they put out basically saying the car can save us. Then in the 1930s, the World Fair came along, and they put out what they called Futurama. So it was a diorama of what it's going to look like in the future if we created these great, big, fancy roads that the National Highway User Conference was talking about. And this is a great picture here. You can see, if you look in the background, you can see people looking at the diorama, and I think that's really neat. But one of the things that you should think about as you're looking at this is this is what they wanted to do in the 1930s. This is another picture from that diorama of what they wanted to do in the 1930s. If I asked you, if I colored this picture and I asked you, when do you think this was made? You would think it was now. And so they were successful. They were successful in getting their vision implemented into our society. Here's another picture, a close-up picture of that town. When you look at this, again, this is very similar to what a lot of our cities are starting to look like now. But the thing I always like to ask when I look at this picture is, what are a few things you don't see here? You see cars, you see a couple of trees, but what the things you don't see people walking. You don't see a way for people to actually get across. If one person's in a building on one side of the street, how do they get to the building on the other side of the street? And then the other thing, and this is interesting, I never thought I would have to think about this, working for a bike ped public transit agency, but what else is missing from this picture? Parking. They forgot about, where do you put these cars when you're not using them? That's something I find that I have to spend lots of time talking about and working on, is parking, and how much parking influences the way our cities are built and the way people behave. But these cars take up a lot of space when you park them. In fact, most people don't realize that an automobile is not in use roughly 95% of the time. So people spend lots and lots of money on these cars to get them from point A to point B, but roughly 95% of the time, cars are not used at all. They're just sitting still, taking up space. So then in the 1950s, Dwight D. Eisenhower signed the Federal Highway Act. Overall, this was a pretty decent thing to do. What it really helped do is develop our highway system, our interstate system. And I will say that I think it was really great that our highway system was developed. In fact, a lot of countries also developed or copied this and developed their own interstate highway systems. However, there was a few problems with this. One of the problems is, within this act was adopted what was known as the Yellow Book. And the Yellow Book was design standards. This is the first time we started to see that architectural design of what a street should look like. And I bet you can guess who designed it. It was the National Highway Users Conference. They were the ones that wrote that Yellow Book. And they specifically did it with a massive bias towards car-only infrastructure. The other problem that came out of this Highway Act was where the interstates went. And this was something Dwight D. Eisenhower was against. And this is also something, if you go to other countries and look at their interstate systems, they didn't do, but we did. We built our interstate systems to cut right through our towns. So if you think about Kansas City, St. Louis, there's any number of towns and cities across the country where we developed interstate systems that go right through the center of towns. This became such a popular idea that we started to not only use interstates through our towns, we started to use highways through our towns. We started to put highways directly through our towns. This had a negative consequence. I usually ask, what do you think it is? But I'll tell you here. What it does is it starts to put up a major barrier between one side of the street to the other side of the street, a huge barrier. It's very difficult now to cross this street that you see in the picture. Yes, there's a bridge there that you can see in this picture, but I'm going to guarantee you these bridges aren't put frequently enough that it's very convenient for a person walking to get to. You may have to walk a quarter mile just to get to that bridge to then cross the street. We do this all over. In fact, I always tell you, like, if you travel around Missouri much and you go through Missouri rural communities and you're on a highway and it goes through a center of town, think about what that highway does for that town and how difficult it is for people on one side of the street to get to the other. And the simplest way to think of it is, How does a kid get from one side of that road to the other side of that road? I always think about like Kirksville when I use this example. I drive up into Kirksville and they have a highway, a Missouri highway that goes right through the town. And it's got stoplights and stop signs all along the way. But if you ask parents, do you let your kid cross that street? Absolutely not. You don't. It doesn't feel safe. It certainly doesn't feel convenient. In fact, there are towns all over Missouri that have highways through them, that have schools on one side of the highway and neighborhoods on the other. And guess what? Those kids don't walk to school, even though the school is probably 100, 200 yards away. And it's because they have to cross this highway. And so we started building these big highways through our communities and really started to divide our communities and separate our communities. And basically, the most convenient and safe way now to get around these communities is to take an automobile. One of the ways that these highways got built is through urban renewal. I'm going to make a large assumption, assume everybody on the chat today understands what urban renewal was, but it was a way to revitalize communities to make them more vibrant, even though there was generally no proof that these communities needed to be revitalized or made vibrant. But they used the excuse of urban renewal a lot of times to come in and build these highways. And so what they would do is they would take a very dense area that's kind of like this in the picture in front of you and say, oh, this place is blighted. We are going to put a highway through it. And this is what happened. You went from an area that was very dense, lots of housing, lots of businesses, to an area that is mostly highway now. And if you actually zoom in on this picture, you'll realize that over 75% of this picture is parking lots. So it's just wasted land. This is in Kansas City, by the way. So this isn't far from home. Also, when we talk about urban renewal, which communities do we think urban renewal happened in? It wasn't in white neighborhoods. It wasn't in wealthy neighborhoods. It was generally in neighborhoods that were primarily people of color or low income. And that's well documented. In fact, there's areas in New York where they wanted to put highways in, but the wealthy white people said, no, you're not doing that. And they shifted them to poorer Black neighborhoods. So this is Kansas City. This is another picture of Kansas City. This is Main Street in Kansas City, what it used to look like and what it is now. And if you zoom in on this picture, it's people of color. And this is where they did it. They took a really cool looking, really vibrant area and said it was blighted and then put a highway in. Then we also have, as part of all of this history, we have what was known as the Federal Housing Administration came in and said, we want to standardize a lot of housing and give loans. And I won't go in again to all the detail on this, but what it did was, it did some good things. It did some good things in the sense that it standardized our electric, our building codes, but it also started to standardize how neighborhoods were built. This is also where we started to get things like the cul-de-sac and where we started to decentralize or decentralize services. So we have homes on one side, we have businesses over here. There's no more mixed use development. This is also the time period where we started doing a lot of things like redlining, not giving loans to people of color. And the whole idea was to build this kind of white-centric utopia that you see here in this picture. Unfortunately, as I mentioned, it did a lot of bad too. But one of the things I think when we look at it from an infrastructure piece is this was the idea that we were sold, this picture. But we were really given this. And while I'm sure the people that live here are fantastic folks, this neighborhood doesn't inspire a lot of joy to me. It's not a place where I feel like the kids are going to be out playing and running around and having a good time and playing in the street. These are the types of neighborhoods we actually ended up with. This is the design of those neighborhoods from the sky. It's no longer mixed use. It's just rows and rows and rows and rows of housing. And so it doesn't spark a lot of joy for me. It also makes it very difficult for people to get around. There are no services here. If a kid wanted to walk to an ice cream shop, there's no ice cream shop. If a kid wanted to walk to their friend's house, unless their friend is on that same road, it's very difficult for them to actually get anywhere. You have to walk quite a while to get from place to place. So it starts to cut people off. We have neighborhoods like this all over Columbia, the urban sprawl, suburban sprawl neighborhoods. We started to get street designs that look like this. And this is not a pleasant place to be. It's not even great for people driving. This is a terrible, if you all think about some of the worst places in town that you don't like driving, this is it. In fact, this street design, what you're seeing here on this page, is the most common street design used in the United States and in Columbia. I'm sure you can all think of places in Columbia that have this. Business Loop, Providence, College Boulevard, all have this design. It is the most common design. So it took our businesses districts as well, our business districts like this that were thriving, or even business districts like we think of as downtown Columbia, and made them illegal to build. If you wanted to replicate downtown Columbia today, you could not do it. It's illegal to do it that way. It took our business districts from this and turned them into this. Again, nobody's spending a lot of time outside their car walking around and going shopping. In fact, most often, if you're going to in the up kind of middle right-hand corner there's a Best Buy. If you need to go to the store on the other side of the shopping center, just across the parking lot, you're going to get in your car and drive. So I did a lot of talking about the history and how the development of streets kind of occurred over time. As I mentioned, that design really hasn't significantly changed since about the 1950s-ish, when that first yellow book kind of came out. But it's important to know that these street designs have an effect on people because it determines who the streets are safe and convenient for. And I would even argue that today, our streets aren't very safe or convenient even for people driving. But that just happens to be the safest and convenient way that we have right now based on our design, but still not great. So it really cuts off a lot of access for a lot of people. I talked a little bit about street designs and them being that architectural design of what each street should look like. And what they really do is they lay out things like the driving lane widths, the sidewalk widths, crosswalks, lighting, bike lanes, what type, what width, what kind of accessibility features does it have? Is there any traffic calming? So those things are all lined out in this. And those interested, so driving lane widths, I mentioned those, and I talked about car-centric design. I would usually let people guess, what is the lane width on I-70? General lane width on I-70 is about 13 feet, 12 to 13 feet. Want to guess what it is probably in your neighborhood based on our street design standards? It's 12 to 13 feet. So we're currently designing roads inside of our city that have similar designs to I-70, at least as far as lane widths are concerned. So we're not making things very safe for people. So what's a livable street? This is what we, the equitable streets, what we call livable streets. We think streets should be designed so that they are safe and convenient. I want to make sure I'm emphasizing convenient, because you can make something safe, but if it's not convenient, no one's going to use it. Things that are safe and convenient for people who are walking, biking, and riding transit. Also with people with disabilities. Keep in mind, we are all only temporarily able-bodied. There are times when we are injured. As we get older, things may happen to us. So we all need to be thinking about this. If you're an older adult, if you're a child, we want the street to work for you. So people that are 8 all the way up to 80 years old, people of color. And if we do all of these things, all the research indicates and has proven that if we do all of these things, it's better for drivers. It's better for them in the way that it's safer. It also becomes less frustrating, because whatever you think about traffic and what's the most annoying thing, and when I ask this question in person, what's the most annoying or frustrating thing about driving? It's other drivers. That's the most frustrating thing. So by doing this, we can take other drivers off the road and make it convenient for those that have to drive or will always drive. Our current standards in Columbia build streets like this. This is Business Loop. I showed you that picture. The most common design doesn't look that much different than the other design we had. If you look at Nifong Boulevard right now, Nifong Boulevard is still this design. It's still that design in that one picture I showed you. It's just 50 years newer. That's the only difference. Over time, it'll begin to look like this as well. We designed streets like this as well. This is State Highway P, or Clark Lane as most people know it. And I'll talk a little bit more about Clark Lane here in a second, but this is an area where a person was struck and killed by a car, a young lady about 18-ish or so, walking home from work. Again, current design on your right there, that's a bus stop. I don't know how a person in a wheelchair is going to access this bus stop. And there's also not a lot of things around this bus stop. Who's going here? And even if they are going here, it sure isn't safe for them to cross. They have to walk up to a quarter mile to get to the first crossing. This is Nifong Boulevard. If you'll notice, this is a bike lane that ends. There's also on the right a sidewalk that ends and a 50-mile-an-hour posted speed limit. There's neighborhoods on one side of the street and shopping on the other. This is not great. No family is saying, hey, let's go shopping and walking or biking. It's not even great for cars. I don't like driving on Nifong. So livable streets. So this was our current standards, kind of what I went through. So what are livable streets? Livable streets, the main focus is on equity. We really want to focus on equity. And through our Vision Zero programs, we know where the highest rates of people of color, low income, low driving rates, and even highest rates of serious injury or death are in the city. And that's where we have what we know as the livable streets neighborhood. So in our opinion, we need to really focus on these neighborhoods to really help improve their infrastructure first. A livable street also prioritizes maintenance and updating versus new infrastructure and sprawl. So often you hear people say, well, just work on maintenance. And that's what I think the majority of the public wants. However, our municipalities, our government tends to continue to build new. Now, I like to use this example here of Clark Lane. When I first moved to Clark Lane 13 years ago, or excuse me, when I first moved to Columbia 13 years ago, the first advocacy issue I ever heard about was how the folks over on Clark Lane wanted a sidewalk. They were asking for a sidewalk. And about every couple of years, I continue to hear those folks asking for a sidewalk. And the number one thing that they generally hear back is, we don't have the money for it. MoDOT will deal with it, or somebody else will deal with it. But basically, we don't have the money for it. Keep in mind, a few years ago, a young woman died in this very spot walking home from her job at McDonald's. It was a high school student. She was a one-car family. And exactly what I talked about earlier was asked by the law enforcement. Why was this woman walking here? Like, they blamed her for walking there. The sidewalk ends the direction she was going. She was going behind us as we're looking at this. The sidewalk ends. They blamed her because she was walking there. She says she shouldn't have been walking there. She was a one-car family. Her mom was at her night job, and this young woman was walking home from her job at McDonald's. So for 13 years, I've heard about being asked for a sidewalk here, but there's no money. This past year, this Discovery Parkway was just completed for a cost of $10 million. This $10 million could have built 10 miles of sidewalks along Clark Lane. Now, Clark Lane is not 10 miles long, but my point is, nobody out here in this area is asking for this road. There's one business, there's no homes, nothing. This is not very equitable to be building this, what would be considered more urban sprawl or new infrastructure, when we have communities asking for things like sidewalks. We should be prioritizing those people. And if we had, maybe that young woman wouldn't have died on her way home from work. Livable streets also prioritize things like biking, walking, and public transit, and safety and convenience. This is Indianapolis. This is downtown Indianapolis. This used to be a big, large, huge road. So think of like College Boulevard or Providence or something like that. And what they did was they made a huge sidewalk on the right, made it a protected area for people riding bikes, and narrowed down the driving lane. And this area is flourishing. You would probably hear people in Columbia say, oh, it's going to have massive traffic jams, and where do I park? Unfortunately, those two problems don't ever become a real problem, and the businesses and people in these corridors flourish. Again, another example. I think that this is a great litmus test or a key indicator. If you see a woman riding a pretty bike in a dress and heels, you're doing it right. You've hit equity as far as street infrastructure goes for people biking, okay? So designing things like this that encourage people or say to people that I belong here, not just that I was an afterthought, but I belong here. And that's what this woman is feeling in this picture. We also need to focus on our roundabouts. I'm a fan of roundabouts, Unfortunately, I'm not a fan of the way we design roundabouts in Columbia. We tend to design roundabouts in Columbia in a way that prioritizes car cut-through traffic or getting through the roundabouts quickly. There are designs that help to make it safer and convenient for people walking and biking, and we highly promote that. Livable streets also promotes things such as access. When you're on Business Loop, it's very hard for you to go from the Popeyes on that one side of the street to cross over to the other side of the street to go to something. So that means there's not very good access along Business Loop. We think access should be prioritized. So if you look at this street here, access is highly prioritized. It's very easy for you to park your car and get where you need to go by foot, bike, or wheelchair. Another example is right here outside the Daniel Boone Regional Library, or just down the street from the Daniel Boone Regional Library. It's also outside my offices. You have on the left side there, that Stewart Park. So there's a park there. There are lots of neighborhoods. On the right side, more neighborhoods. Just off over here, there's a daycare. There's a school. There's the public library. There's office complex. This street is designed for cut-through traffic or mobility. It is not designed for access. People do not feel safe walking to school, walking to the library, along Broadway in this section. And so we need to do things that help prioritize that access. And we can do things like that. There are designs out there to come back and make things feel calmer and safer for people outside the car. And the other thing we need to do is we need to start designing streets so that they're what we call self-enforcing design. Both of these streets have a 20-mile-an-hour speed limit. Guess which street you think people actually drive 20 miles an hour on? And you don't even have to put up a speed limit sign. So, and if you, it's not Maupin, but the one on the bottom there looks a lot like Maupin to me. So how can you help? If you know of speaking events where I can come to and talk, we are trying to get a livable streets policy passed with the city of Columbia, hopefully here in the next 2 months or so. And that livable streets policy will update design standards for our roadway. So if you know of places I can come and talk about this, I'd really appreciate it. You can sign our petition as well. And I'll put a link in the chat where you can sign our petition, where you can write a letter to the city council. And so here's a little letter that we've been sending postcards, but there's an online letter just saying that you support livable streets. And we also have yard signs, which I'll put a link in the chat for that as well. If you'd like one of our yard signs, maybe you've seen them around town. If you want one, sign up and we'll get you one. And then if you see our stuff on social media, share it, like it. Any questions? I know we have a few minutes anyway.
Yeah, thank you so much, Lauren. I guess the big question, and I think you talked about it a little bit, was examples from other US cities. You already mentioned Amsterdam and Copenhagen worldwide, but other cities where you think are good examples of having livable streets.
Yeah, unfortunately, there's not a lot of great places in the United States. This is it's transitioning in the United States. I'm now, Lauren, just seeing your email here or your chat question as well, so I can answer that. There's not a lot of great examples here. There are a lot of great examples of other communities doing similar work that are a little ahead of us in terms of they've updated their street design standards and are now in the process. You know, it took us 100 years to get here. It's going to take some time for this to change. It's not going to change overnight. And so as you look across the country, you know, Minneapolis has just made a great update to their road design standards. In fact, a lot of communities around Missouri, while this design standard that we're going to promote for the city of Columbia is more a little bit more advanced, the ones that are around most of Missouri are actually better than our current one now. So rural communities around Missouri have better ones than we do. The best I think right now is Minneapolis. Boston's done some good things, but those are larger communities. But we were the first community to be a Vision Zero community, first small community to adopt complete streets. we think we can be the first community to start adopting what's known as livable streets.
I just want to say thank you for the history. That was fascinating, and I think something that a lot of people hadn't really learned or heard about. So that puts it in really good context. And I also wanted to let you know that we will be putting this on our website and in our newsletter, so that, and recording it so that many other people can listen to it. So we'll be promoting that. And I was on the I-70 advisory committee with you. That's just still in progress. And I really appreciate your input on making sure that I-70 improvements accommodate walkers and bikers. You might want to talk a little bit about some of your thoughts on what needs to be done there, because they're still seeking public input on that.
Yeah, and I think they have a meeting tomorrow at the ARC from 4 to 6. And my comments aren't necessarily as much about the actual I-70 corridor as questions were asked. My concerns generally relate to how do you cross I-70? So anytime there's a place for someone to cross I-70, there's a lot of conflict points for people walking and biking, whether that be at Stadium and the Diverging Diamond. There's a lot of issues over by Aldi's. If everybody knows, the Aldi's by off Business Loop there by I-70, the roundabouts they put in there have been really difficult for people to cross. And also over by the I-70-63 interchange, which is the only thing I think that has funding currently right now. We know that that is an area that has a high percentage of people who are struck and killed by motor vehicles because of, there's a lot of pedestrian drivers over there, and pedestrian drivers are places that people walking could potentially want to go. And so there's no good, safe way to cross, 63 or 70 or anything in that area. So people usually end up putting their lives at risk to cross in those. So my comments generally are around how do we cross these big, large roads, and are we making it safe for them? And so, yeah, I would encourage anybody to go to that meeting tomorrow at the ARC and have similar input that I do.
Right. So thank you so much. This was very informative, and hopefully our organization and members can help further support this concept and your work. And I want to mention to everyone before we leave that our next Lunch and Learn program is December 13th, our regular Tuesdays. This was early because Election Day is next Tuesday, and we usually do it on the second Tuesday. But we'll have our Lunch and Learn program December 13th with a guest speaker, Tony Simone from the Missouri Supreme Court Civic Education Committee, who will talk about judges in the Supreme Court. So that should be very interesting. And then I just encourage everyone to vote November 8th or do early voting. And thank you again to the library and Lauren. And thank you, Lawrence.
Thanks so much.